Okay, this is Arthur Bush. You're listening to Radio Free Flint, and today's episode is author Pat Majher, who is an author, and whose book about
great girls in Michigan history.
Yeah, I always get it mixed up because you've also wrote a second book about bold boys.
Bold boys.
I get it mixed up sometimes when I was thinking about this interview, and I was calling them bold girls and great boys. But,
I went for the alliteration. Yeah.
There you go. So anyway, Patricia is a notable book award. I don't know if it's a winner. It's you won an award for the book about the girls from the State of Michigan Library for this past year, being that it was one of the best books according to those who are in the book business. I thought I would ask her to come and join us. And the hook for me was that she writes about some well-known Flint area residents in her book. So welcome to my podcast, Pat.
Thank you.
Tell me about your books. Just introduce them to us.
Sure. I should probably talk a little bit about my background and how I got to writing these books. I trained as a journalist, and I also have a degree in historic preservation, so I have a love of history. I was actually working at a museum in Lansing, Michigan Women's Hall of Fame, and I used to do the exhibits there, among other things. And I did an exhibit on Michigan's female lighthouse keepers. And that ended up as a book because I'd done a lot of research for it. But one of the things that I also kind of spun off from that experience was there was a story about a child who was a daughter of a lighthouse keeper who had saved a man's life in the Detroit River. It just got me thinking that there might be more stories about girls who had done something amazing before they were 20.
The name of the book about the lighthouses?
It's Ladies of the Lights, Michigan Women in the U.S. Lighthouse Service. You know, there are so many biographies out there of famous women and famous Michigan women. I think as a child reading something like that, you can relate a bit more if it's someone your age. So that's why I focused on significant events that occurred early in the lives of these girls. So it's 20 chapters, which amounts to 20 mini-biographies of women who had some sort of connection to Michigan. Even if they didn't go on to become famous, they did something famous when they were young.
Right. And you've had a long time interest in history in your prior life before you started writing books. You were the editor of one of my favorite magazines.
Yeah, I was editor of Michigan History for 7 years. That was another place that, certainly sparked an interest in me to gather information about girls first and then boys. I wrote a second book on boys. I came across so many stories, so many achievements that I felt there was enough here to make this series of 2 books. And Wayne State University Press agreed with me.
The second book you wrote is about boys, which is a corollary or parallel to the girls. What was the criteria that you used to select the people who you ultimately found, who ultimately found their way into the book itself?
Well, with both the girls and the boys, as I was making those choices, I could have written a book just about girls and boys in the arts, because that's a field where, you start very young if you're a singer, a dancer, whatever, actor. And the other field where kids start young is athletics. So that could have been a whole separate book on its own. But I wanted to make the books accessible to people of all interests or kids of all interests. I really varied, the field that these children excelled in. Also tried, culturally, also tried to get different time periods and different parts of the state so that any child anywhere in Michigan could hopefully find someone they could relate to in that book.
The book that you wrote for these kids is used for what age groups again?
Elementary and middle school.
So in the Flint area, you have selected 3 individuals in these 2 books. Sara Emma Edmonds, Jim Abbott, and Michael Moore. Interesting choices. Did you structure the writing to make it at a certain level of reading? How do you construct a book like this just targeted at kids?
It was a little bit challenging. I don't have any training as a teacher, but I did have people who reviewed the text who were teachers. There's also software you can use to kind of run your text past and see what grade level it fits. I sort of wrote each chapter and then went back and made sure that the words were either something that children in elementary or middle school would understand, or I developed a glossary for each book because there were just some things that are associated with different fields most people wouldn't know. Like I was writing about Julie Crone, who was a jockey, and one of the words I came across reading about her was hot walking. That's essentially talks about cooling down a horse after it's been running. I thought, well, this isn't something everybody knows. And I frankly had never heard the term either. There is a glossary in the back for some of those kinds of terms or explaining some of the bigger concepts like prohibition or whatever. Yeah, I mean, it's still about writing a good story, writing an engaging story, no matter what your audience is.
And the subjects of the book, you focused in on their accomplishments before the age of 20.
Mm-hmm.
So thus you picked Jim Abbott, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Most of us know his story. For the sake of repeating it for many in my audience who may not know his story, why don't you just give us a little summary of that gentleman?
Sure. Yeah.
Why he's important.
One of the reasons why I picked Jim was that I wanted to have someone who had overcome a physical challenge. In his case, he was born without one of his hands, his right hand. In the books in general, I try to bring these inspirational elements, to the fore, because again, that's something I want the kids to come away with, that, you can overcome difficulties, whether it's poverty or you were abused, or, you had a disability, or your family didn't have a father or whatever, and you still overcame that. So Jim, I have to say the focus for Jim was on, lacking that hand and how challenging it was for him to become the great pitcher he was, starting with that.
Paul Staroba, the University of Michigan football player, also played in the NFL. He spoke about Jim Abbott. If you want to know what kind of person Jim Abbott is, because he's a whole person, he said, all you got to do is go back and look at some film, because during the Olympics, I forget what year it was, he pitched in the Olympics. He was the guy that carried the flag out. He was selected by all the people there, all of the Olympians on the American side, to be the one guy that they wanted most to be out front and represent our country.
Mm-hmm.
And it demonstrated, at least to Paul and to me, that he has some genuine leadership skills.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even today he speaks as a motivational speaker, so that continues, that strength of his, definitely that can-do spirit. There haven't been too many people in any of the major sports that have risen in their sport, with some sort of disability. So thought his story was astounding. And when I told people who I was including in my book, I would list the names and they'd be like, oh yeah, Jim Abbott, I remember him. So, I think he resonated with people outside of baseball and outside of sports too. I think he was thought of very highly even as a child. He wasn't kind of an underdog in that sense, but, he was a star at Flint Central, even was the quarterback on their football team for a while. And frankly, I would have put him in the book even without him going on to, to U of M and to, the professional.
Yeah, I mean, he pitches in the World Series. He pitches in the Olympic
Mm-hmm.
Games. He's
pitched a no-hitter.
The University of Michigan.
He was very enjoyable to work with.
Just for your book, I'd like to add my own editorial on him. He comes from a wonderful family. Kathy and Mike Abbott are his parents. And they're just wonderful people. And they've been involved in the Flint community. And his grandpa was a businessman here in town, well known. He just exhibits all the great qualities of his parents and his grandparents.
Mm.
And we're so very proud of him here in Flint. All right, moving along. We've given him accolades. He's She's close to sainthood. The one that I know you wrote about 40 people or some such thing as this, but I want to ask you a question about what I thought was one of the most interesting historical figures before I ever knew you wrote a book, and that was Sara Emma Edmonds. And tell us her story and what you think about her in terms of the vantage point of history.
Well, Sara was a person that I came to know when I was at the Michigan Women's Hall of Fame. She was in the Hall of Fame, and she's one of the female figures from Michigan from the Civil War period who served in the Civil War. And generally, those women served undercover, if you will, portraying a man, and were not known, to be women at the time they served. But Sara was certainly one of the more colorful characters in that history. She was actually a Canadian by birth and came from a very challenging family life. Just made her way very early on, leaving Canada and making her way toward Flint. I don't exactly know why she chose Flint, because she moved a couple of times, but that was the place from which she enlisted in the Civil War. And she had her father was abusive, and so that's why she fled Canada. Basically, he wanted to marry her off as a young teen, and he was having none of it. So she came to America. She actually changed her name. Her name was Edmund's Son, but she dropped the son part in hopes of staying kind of under the radar from her father. And certainly after she joined the army, she definitely got away from him. But she did some interesting things that were kind of non-traditional. She wasn't necessarily somebody who was, had her Springfield rifle and was on the front lines. She would carry mail between the various Union encampments. And at one point, she asked to be a spy. They were looking for spies, people who could portray a spy and get into the Confederate side of things on that side of the battlefield. There, she did actually portray a slave as a means of getting into these camps. And while she was working hard for the Confederate Army and whatever, menial tasks they were giving to enslaved people, she would gather information about how many troops there were at this particular place or what their weapons were. And then she would escape at night and run back to where the Union Army was camped and deliver those messages. And she actually wrote a book about herself in which some historians think she embellished the stories a bit, but I'm sure some parts of it were true, and it was probably just an exaggeration more than anything. But anyway, in any event, she was a nurse. She acting as a male nurse. She called herself Frank Thompson. And then she contracted malaria, was quite sick, and she wanted to be helped, but she couldn't go to the doctor because he would have exposed her as a woman. So she actually left the army, just, AWOL, and then came back as a woman and then served as a nurse again. So she just felt very strongly that the Union Army and should be the victor in that war, and that enslaved people should be freed. So she did her best to stay in the war as long as she could until the malaria and then later a leg injury really kind of caught up with.
So for those of you that are listening to this, if you go downtown to Flint, at the corner of Saginaw and Court Street, you'll see there is a large stone that honors Sara Emma Edmonds, and has been there for a long time. And it has her story as well there. So what do you want the kids to draw from this story of Sara?
Well, again, difficult beginnings, which she overcame by leaving her father. Sort of a resilience of, even though she was injured at one point and got malaria at another point, she kept coming back to serve. She obviously at some risk to herself. She would have been sent home directly if she had been found out at any point. But she just, embraced any opportunity that came her way to advance the Union cause. She was actually able, even though she was an imposter for a time, she was actually able to get a pension from the government and be elected into the membership of the Grand Army of the Republic. So she was, even in her time, she was well regarded, let alone ours. We still talk about her.
Okay, the third one from Flint was Michael Moore, the filmmaker, the documentarian. And why did you select Michael Moore, and what do you think his significance is to history?
Well, I was intrigued by, I knew of Michael Moore from his movies, but I was intrigued that he was a very early office holder, the school board in Davison, shortly after the voting age dropped and young people could run for office, he did. I thought that was the hook for me, that someone so young would care so much about political and social issues that he, what some people would regard as a child, was serving on the school board, which was obviously a cause near and dear to his heart as he was in school. So that's why I selected him. Again, I wasn't focused on what he did afterwards, but what did this famous person do as a child that sort of showed us very early on, what he was made of and how his strong opinions and passion for social issues was evident even then.
And it continued. And I don't think he was welcomed with open arms by the administration of the school.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, by the end of his tenure on the board, the principal of his school, which was the motivator for him to get involved in school politics, the principal had resigned. So, he was very instrumental in making big changes in Davison. And at the time, he was the youngest person serving in a political office in the country.
And he got involved in a lot of causes when he was under 20 as well. And then he turned that all into an effort to write a paper. I mean, he published a newspaper,
Mm-hmm.
and then was involved in other sort of issues, especially women's issues, counseling and so forth. He has quite a colorful past and great parents also. I know his parents. They're passed away now, but wonderful parents who, if you talk to the parents, you'll say, where'd he come from? Frank, particularly, what a wonderful guy, devoutly religious. That's another story about Michael Moore that a lot of people don't know is he wanted to be a priest. And I think he even attended the seminary at that under the age of 20. I don't know if you put that in your story, but now, all right, so we got Flint out of the way. So basically, you think his significance to history is his age. He's the youngest guy in the country to hold office. He's part of the Cultural Revolution at the tail end, stuff like that, right?
Well, at least as a young person, that was his significance. Obviously he's an Oscar winner, which I'm a movie lover, so I appreciate that. But that came later. So yeah, I think as a child, what drew me to his story was, such a passion for social and political issues at a young age and serving in an office that most people didn't at the age of 18.
Moving along, I know the book that was selected as the notable book was the about the girls. So let's go over to that. What might the readers find in that of great significance?
The story, as I said, that motivated me to start with the children's books was about this girl who had been a lifesaver in the Detroit River. Excuse me. And she was the daughter of a lighthouse keeper on an island in the river. And her father had gone away from the lighthouse station to this nearby Wyandotte where they would, shop and get their mail and such. And she and her mother were left there. And they received a call from a passing steamer notifying them that there was somebody who was apparently floundering in the river. Even though she was only 13 or 14 at the time, she jumped in the rowboat that they were left with after their dad took the big boat and rowed out a mile and saved this man and brought him back. And it was cold water, and he probably would have succumbed if she hadn't come to his rescue.
What was her name?
Her name was Maybelle Mason.
Okay.
And it was obviously big news in Detroit that she had done this, but it became big news nationally, and she was given an award, a silver medal for life-saving by the U.S. government. The gold medal is only given if you lose your life. That's a posthumous award. You don't want that one. So anyway, as a child, again, and a female child at that, for her to save someone's life and be recognized, at the national level. She also received a separate medal from the Shipmasters Association, which were the captains who sailed the Great Lakes. They really kind of took her under their wing, as they were really enthralled with her story too. Legend has it that certain captains would toot their horn when they passed by the island as sort of a tip of the hat to her after, she had done this amazing thing and before she got married and left the island. So, yeah, I just thought that was incredibly heroic for a child in a moment's notice to take upon herself to rescue.
What year was this?
Oh boy, you're going to make me look this one up, aren't you?
I'm sorry, you don't know.
So many people, so many dates and such that I didn't memorize.
I was just thinking that if this happened today, she'd probably end up on 60 Minutes.
It was in 1890. And there's a wonderful picture in the book of her wearing her two medals. She had gotten a formal portrait done as a young teen. She didn't end up going on to become a lighthouse keeper herself or anything that we could really document besides wife and mother. That was part of the thing that I wanted to do with this book, was show that I didn't just focus on people who were famous adults, and find out what they did as children. I was really looking from the child's perspective. That was most important to me.
Any others that come to mind?
Can't help but have somebody like Diana Ross in the book. She and the Supremes started very early, again, as young teens, being recognized by Mary Gordy. And then he essentially made them wait a little while, like he didn't want, them to be losing out on school and their lives, as young girls. So, he basically made them come back in a couple of years. She just had this, natural talent that was recognized in the neighborhood and in singing contests around Detroit. Eventually she came to be, the shining female star, at least, of the Motown empire.
Were you able to interview any of these people? Because some of them, obviously, they're still alive.
I did interview some people, and others I sent a message and didn't receive any call back. So there wasn't anything I was writing about that was, controversial. So I felt comfortable moving ahead without, their formal interview with them.
Did you ever get a chance to interview Michael Moore?
He was one person I didn't get a response back from.
Well, I think you should show up on his podcast, is what I think. He's got a podcast called Rumble, and out of due respect to you for selecting him for one of the top awards in Michigan, I think he owes you one.
Well, you can put in a good word for me.
I'm going to send him a note. All right. So, what about Jim Abbott or Diana Ross? Did you get a chance to talk to them?
I did with Jim, yes. Not with Diana. There's another person that I'm sure they get dozens or hundreds of these kinds of requests. They only respond to something, not from a person they've never heard of, All
right. So my curiosity is satisfied on that subject. Question: who is the most unusual one that you spoke to?
Well, I think Julie Crone, the jockey. She was from Southwest Michigan. I appreciate women who, step outside the norm in terms of their career choices and, proceed no matter what. And she was that in spades. I mean, she, not only did she have to work her way up in the thoroughbred horse racing ranks, because there are jockeys already there, but she physically fought the jockeys. I mean, that's how determined she was to be a jockey and to show that she was tough enough to be part of their fraternity.
One of the people that you interviewed was Jack White.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He's the rocker from Detroit.
Yep. He's obviously still very interested in Detroit. He's got a record store and employs a lot of people in the area in Detroit, though he now lives in Nashville. Yeah, he was kind enough to provide photos and to, read my text and, give me a thumbs up or thumbs down. And, he seemed, very thrilled to be part of the book and recognized that way. Very accommodating, very open.
Why did you include Jack in the White Stripes?
Well, again, trying to get that variety of fields, of endeavor. In his case, obviously, he's one of the younger people that I included in the book. So there was that too.
I mean, what was it about his life that merited being chosen on your list?
He was really a musical prodigy. Could just pick up an instrument and learn it, and was playing in bands before he turned 20. So, not the White Stripes came after that, and all the other bands he's been a part of since then. Yeah, he was considered a musical prodigy in the rock world in Detroit.
Did any of these people get into some alternative? I mean, you've talked about lighthouse keepers, you've talked about social activism, you've talked about military service, you've talked about musical artists. Mm-hmm. How about some other? Did you talk to any lawyers?
Stevens T. Mason in the book for boys, and he was called the boy governor of Michigan.
Okay, tell that story. That's a great story. I know.
Yeah. So he was reading the law, as they would have said, I guess, in that era, as he was kind of making that rise in politics. His father was actually the secretary of the state, of the territory, I should say, at that time. His father was, he didn't wish to continue in that role, but he had brought Stevens along with him when he moved to Michigan from his home in Kentucky. Stevens, or as he was called, Tom, at that time, loved, the political life, and he loved being in Detroit, where the capital was at that time. He was kind of a man about town, even as a teenager. He actually just served in an interim way when there was a time period between the two governors of the territory. But he was such a young governor when he was actually elected governor. That's why they refer to him as the boy governor. William, he's the person for whom Mason County and the city of Mason are named. And there are a lot of schools named for him, because he was the first governor after Michigan became a state. In 1831, when he was the interim.
If you look at your book about girls in particular, women have made a lot of progress over the years in America. Mm-hmm. Sara Emma Edmonds could fight in the war, but she couldn't vote. What does your research tell you about the trajectory of women? So if let's say 50 years from now, some podcaster is going to interview somebody about women of great accomplishment in Michigan, where's that going?
Fortunately, somebody like Sara had to start off as an imposter in the field that she was interested in. Then there came the point where women were a minority in the field, and even today, I think you could say that of the military. And then, obviously the next step is where women are more evenly represented, across different job fields. But I think there are certain traits that the girls shared that I picked, and I didn't know that until I really explored their lives further. And Sarah's a good example of this. One of the traits of both the boys and the girls, for that matter, was that they had a strong father figure, negative or positive. Hers was negative, because he was an abusive man. But there were other girls who had very positive relationships with their fathers, who were, encouraged by their fathers to try in these fields. So I found that very interesting that, most of these girls lived during a time when their mothers were, working at the home. There weren't careers necessarily for a lot of careers for women in the 1830s or whatever. So I think that's why the mother's influence wasn't as strong. But there was, this very dominant pattern of either, a very positive or a very negative father. And usually it was positive for the girls, and for the boys, it was usually negative, that their father left the family, or he was a drinker, or, somebody who couldn't hold a job or whatever. So these boys would, look at that situation and say, I got to step up for my whole family. So that, that was interesting to me in both cases, that the father was such a strong figure. But there were, a lot of the kids came from some sort of challenge, whether it was a physical challenge or poverty or slavery. That was another thing, was their life was challenging, but they didn't feel sorry for themselves. They really kind of picked themselves up and did, whatever it was they were doing. They were bound, determined to excel, But they all also did their work for fun. They really enjoyed what they did, didn't think it was work. That was a big motivator too, was they just really enjoyed what they were doing.
If you look at the future for women and girls, obviously the most obvious one that we might talk about at some point in our lives, or in the next generation, our children, is a woman president.
Yeah, and obviously we've had 2 women governors here in Michigan. When I wrote the book, Jennifer Granholm would have been a candidate, except she grew up in Canada. And this book was about Michigan.
What's the oldest example that you've used?
Jane Johnston Schoolcraft. She was a Native American who became the first Native American literary writer in America. And she was born in 1800. She was the youngest.
The more recent ones are the Jack Whites of the world and so forth.
Yeah, Serena Williams is a very recent one. Obviously, she's still in her career as a tennis player. She was born in Saginaw, which was her mom's hometown. And she never lived in Michigan for any, extended period of time, but we claim her. She was born here.
Wow, that's amazing. I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
Well, there's some women that you left off. So, every book, every movie, it has what's on the cutting floor. For some people, may be more interesting than what's in the book. What was on your cutting floor that you just couldn't squeeze in?
Probably more people in the arts and athletics, because there were just so many of those candidates. And since I've read or written the books, I've had people approach me with, what about this person? What about that person? And I'd love to write a volume 2 of both books.
But if somebody wants to buy this book, I mean, whether it's a grandma or the mom, or, as a gift or whatever, how would they go about doing that? Through Wayne State University Press?
They can certainly go to their website. They can buy it through Amazon, and a lot of bookstores carry them in the children's section. So those would be, my 3 best suggestions for getting it.
The other thing that I wanted to ask you, just as you leave, are you working on another project?
I actually just published a book. It came out in October, and it's the worst thing to do during a pandemic. The worst book. It's a travel guide. It's a travel guide to the town I live in, Ann Arbor, and I've lived here for 40 years. It just is about all the things you might think it would be, shopping, entertainment, restaurants, sports, all of this. And it's 100 things to do before you die in Ann Arbor. And it's part of a series, so I didn't have any choice in that title, but yeah, it was a really, really bad title.
Who publishes that book?
Reedy Press, Reedy Press.
Thank you for joining us here at Radio Free Flint. We appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.